I would like to welcome everybody back to the second panel for our Business and Human Rights in Southeast Asia panel discussions. Again, I would like to welcome everybody, especially your speakers. Just a quick reminder that from this moment on, we will be on Facebook Live. So everything will be broadcasted to a larger audience on our Facebook panel. And accordingly, it would be good to go through the webinar guidelines before we go anywhere deeper. We would like to invite everybody to have all the participants please be muted upon entry. And the video will be permanently disabled for all of the participants except our speakers to conserve bandwidth. For any questions and answers, please use the raise hand function in Zoom, and updates from the Asia Center team will be put into the chat box accordingly as we progress towards. And we would like to invite all of our participants and speakers to share our Facebook Live link through their preferred methods of social media. The link will be put into the chat box after this, so the link should be available there. Now, to shortly introduce Asia Center for the second half of our discussions, once again, the Asia Center is a regional organization located in Thailand. We are proud to be accredited with a UN ECOSOC consultative status. And as a not-for-profit social enterprise, we primarily pursue evidence-based research, various activities and events, and various forms of media and social media advocacy. Accordingly, we have both a YouTube channel and a LinkedIn profile, both of which will be placed into the chat box. And once again, we will invite all of our participants to use the common vernacular, like and share on YouTube, and to follow us on LinkedIn, if they please to do so. And finally, as still part of introductions, we are going to have our 7th conference coming soon, specifically between the 24th and the 26th of August, 2022. And we would like to invite all of our participants that if they are interested in participating or otherwise collaborating with the conference, we would love to hear from you through our various communication channels available going forward. So, as I said in the beginning, welcome back to the second panel of our Business and Human Rights in Southeast Asia, Progress Towards Developing National Action Plans discussion. I am Dr. Balazs Szanto. I happen to be a senior researcher here at the Asia Center. And we would like to thank our partners with the Friedrich Naumann Foundation for their collaboration with today's event. This is panel 2. Earlier today, before lunch, we had already a panel where there was some lively discussion taking place on how BHR has already become part of the larger regional landscapes, and accordingly how various NAPs and apps are being developed, and how all of these processes facilitate the deepening of rights and democracy in Southeast Asia at large. Now, soon I will pass on to the baton to Dr. Robin, who will briefly introduce the key findings of the book and lead into the discussion at hand. But before we do that, I would like to invite all of our participants to take part in our first poll. We're going to have one poll at the beginning of the panel and one at the end. And the question for this poll is going to be, do you think business organizations are taking seriously the business and human rights agenda? And there will be 4 potential answers to this question. A, very seriously. B, somewhat seriously. C, not very seriously. And D, not at all. So The poll is open now through our various channels, and I will pass the baton on to Dr. Robin to present the findings of the book while we wait for everyone to complete the survey.
Very good. Thank you, Dr. Balazs. Let me, as Dr. Balazs says, give you a brief summary of the key findings, the top-level findings of our book in partnership with the Friedrich Naumann Stiftung. So the first top-level global point of the report is that there has been an initial, though grudging, uptake by states that has engendered a cascade. I use the word cascade generously, in slow-moving NAP development processes. Yeah, so this speaks to the normative, the overall normative picture that there is a BHR process ongoing in the region. It is about 10 years old. It's been slow moving, but nevertheless, it is moving, progressing. That relates to the second point, which is that Thailand has taken the lead, to its credit, in developing a NAP and adopting one in 2019, after a process of 2-3 years of discussions. Others are poised to do the same, notably in Indonesia and Malaysia. Though efforts have been delayed by the COVID-19 pandemic and political uncertainty, and in other cases, although you cannot speak of NAP processes, for example, in places like Vietnam, or the report, our book mentions Myanmar, but of course there is no real process yet in Myanmar, although there have been some initial mentions about the possibility. So Thailand has taken the lead. Indonesia and Malaysia are at a more advanced stage in terms of moving towards a NAP, and perhaps others may and hopefully will follow in the next few years. Third point is to note that, yes, Southeast Asian states have begun to the process of adopting NAPs, like other parts of the world. It should be noted, however, that national human rights institutions and civil society organizations have taken the lead in pushing for NAPs on BHR, in fact, even before states themselves, governments themselves, began to their national executive-driven processes. So that is important to note. And the role of national human rights commissions and civil society organizations is very important to note here. Thirdly, fourthly, key stakeholders, which should be included, have largely been absent from the NAP's development processes across the region. Parliamentarians, which are their role is examined in this report, and I think this is a novel aspect of the discussion on BHR, is the role of parliamentarians, which was discussed this morning. And it was pointed out in the book and in the discussion this morning that they have been absent due significantly to the lack of awareness of the BHR, Business Human Rights Agenda, and they have not participated in these executive-led processes, at least to a minimal extent. And more worrying is their lack of awareness, lack of understanding of the BHR agenda. So that is something, as the speaker this morning, Paulo Zamora, noted, that requires further attention and further engagement on, in particular, by parliamentarians, and that is a welcome development. And again, that is, I think a novel aspect of this particular book, which examines the state of NAPs in the region. Finally, the second key stakeholder that's missing, due to the lack of interest, perhaps, and today we have a fantastic speaker, Mr. Thomas, who will speak to that. The speakers will be properly introduced by our moderator later on, so I will say no more on that. And finally, the fifth point is that a key challenge to NAP's development processes globally and in the region is their alignment to international human rights standards. So though they may be only policy documents, they are nevertheless, from our perspective, they are nevertheless very important documents, very important action plans to help to further localize, internalize international human rights standards deeply into the local and regional mores and policies and culture. And so the idea is that NAPs can and must and should help to foster, to deepen the democratic culture and the human rights culture in the region. So with that said, let me turn the floor back over to Dr. Balazs.
Okay, thank you. Before we proceed any further, it would be good to look at the poll results. And if we look at the poll results, we can see that unfortunately many people are not very optimistic about the uptake of business organizations when it comes to BHR, with the largest response group being the not very committed category with 43% of the respondents. But in contrast, very seriously and somewhat seriously has a combined percentage of 40%. So it's nearly half is somewhat optimistic or very optimistic about business organizations. And there is a small group of 7% who are very pessimistic about business organizations' uptake of BHR. Well, hopefully it's going to represent a positive trend going forward. With that, my final function is going to be introducing our moderator for the panel, Husai Chantarawirod, who is a regional program officer for the Friedrich Naumann Foundation for Freedom, the regional office for Southeast and East Asia, and he will be moderating the panel. So I will press the button to Husai, and once again, thank you for joining the panel.
Thank you, Dr. Balazs, and thank you, Dr. Robin. Good afternoon, every participant from across all platforms. My name is Husai Chantarawirod. I'm a regional program officer at Friedrich Naumann Foundation, Southeast and East Asia office, Bangkok. I'll be a moderator for today's panel discussion. As Dr. Robin mentioned about the earlier panel today, that the role of parliamentarians are missing regarding to support the structure of the National Action Plan itself. So today we'll be looking into the business organization roles on how are they adapting or how are they supporting and implementing the National Action Plan or the business and human rights agenda itself. So I would like to introduce all speakers in order. First, we have Ms. Betty Yolanda. She's a Asia Regional Manager at Business and Human Rights Resource Center. Next, we have Mr. Thomas, a CEO at Asean CSR Network. Next, we have Mr. Edmund Bond, a lawyer at Bond. And lastly, we have Mr. Sao Takahashi, Asia Center Advisory Board and Professor of Human Rights and Peace Study at Osaka Jogakuin University. So, but before we going into the panel discussion, I would like to remind every speaker regarding the rules and for discussion. So each speaker will have 8 to 10 minutes maximum for their talk. And I would like to invite all of you to give your brief reaction towards the report by mentioning through your particular areas of work and expertise. So without further ado, I would like to invite Ms. Betty Yolanda for the first reflect session.
Thank you, Husai. Good afternoon, everyone. First of all, I'd like to thank the Asia Center for inviting me to be part of this important event, and also to congratulate the Asia Center for the launch of the book. And it's a pleasure for me to share the panel with the experts in this field, with Sol, with Thomas, and also Edmund. As has been introduced by Husai, my name is Betty Yolanda, and I'm the Asia Regional Manager of the Business and Human Rights Resource Center, and I'm currently based in Jakarta, Indonesia. I'm not sure whether you know my organization, the Business and Human Rights Resource Center. So we are a leading international NGO founded in 2002 that has become the main global source of information in relations to business and human rights issues by tracking both positive and negative human rights impacts of more than 10,000 companies worldwide. And we have all this information translated on our website in 10 languages. And I have actually skimmed the report yesterday, and my intervention today is really to reflect on the findings that are presented in the book. And I will do that by also sharing the reflections that we gathered from our civil society partners last year through a survey that we did in 10 countries across the world, including countries in Southeast Asia. But before I go into my interventions, the first point that I would like to make would be, in addition to Thailand and Japan that have adopted and launched their National Action Plan on Business and Human Rights, actually, we have the third country in Asia that just recently launched its NAP, which is Pakistan, which launched either in September or October. I forgot the exact month. And also South Korea back in 2018, where they adopted their Human Rights National Action Plan, which contains a chapter on business and human rights. Across Asia, actually, we have 6 countries that are currently in the process of developing a NAP on BHR, which are Bangladesh, Indonesia, India, Malaysia, Vietnam, and Mongolia. And I didn't see Mongolia and Bangladesh being mentioned in the report, but I think it's good because it's very recent, although the level of the development of the process is somewhat different from these 6 countries. And that being said, actually, there are 9 countries in Asia that either have launched a NAP or are in the process of developing a NAP on business and human rights. So just going back to the first point that I mentioned about reflections that we have gathered from our civil society partners in 10 countries across the globe, we found a few interesting reflections. So when we did the survey with our civil society partner, we focused on 3 stages of the process of the NAP. So the first one is the initiations and preparation stage, the drafting stage, and then the implementation, monitoring, and evaluation stage. So I will just share some of the key reflections in relation to each stage. So when it comes to the initiations and the preparation stage, we ask our civil society partners with regard to the key factors that contributed to the initiations of the process. The majority, if not all of our partners actually said that the initiation came from 2 aspects. First, calls from civil society, and then government initiative. So calls from civil society is really based on the documentations that they have conducted with regard to human rights violations related to business operations in their respective countries. And then when it comes to government initiative, actually, as also mentioned in the book, that in the context of, in the case of Thailand, it was because of the UPR recommendation provided by the government of Sweden. But in other countries, actually, the initiation or the government initiative was also influenced by, for example, the candidacy of the state to membership at the UN Human Rights Council, or also the recommendations coming from the UN Working Group following their official visit to their country. So it's very different in terms of what really influenced the government initiative in terms of pushing for the NAP process. And then in terms of the institution or government entity that is tasked with with developing the NAP or other actors that are part of the process, the majority also said that usually there's a ministry coordinating the discussion and also the process in the government. In addition to the ministry, actually, many also mentioned the involvement of other non-governmental stakeholders such as academia, UN bodies like OHCHR or UNDP, as well as civil society organizations. I also would like to link this to also the finding in the book saying that there's a lack of involvement of parliamentarians, which is true. From the survey that we did, actually, there's only one country that mentions about the involvement of members of the legislative branch, which is from the Central America in Mexico. None of the 9 countries, and the other 9 countries didn't mention about the involvement of parliamentarians or a representative from the legislative branch. In terms of the type of the NAP itself, actually, many of the countries really focus on developing a standalone document instead of integrating the business and human rights framework into relevant frameworks that the country already have. In Asia, for example, Thailand has a standalone NAP, and then Indonesia also, and it's quite different from what is happening in Asia and also what is happening in South America, because in many countries in South America, they prefer to have the NAP on business and human rights be integrated in their human rights national action plan. And in terms of participation and also inclusive engagement of different stakeholders, the survey really showed how government's efforts to ensure inclusive engagement and participation to be very limited. So many said that it's either no consultations or very little efforts from the government to ensure inclusive engagement and participation. Even if there's a space for civil society and other stakeholders to engage with the process itself was flawed, because most of the time the process really excluded the key stakeholders such as indigenous peoples or affected communities. And even in the process also, the draft itself was not made public or even shared last minute before the consultations with stakeholders. And when it comes to the drafting stage, actually, one of the questions that we asked was about the disclosure of relevant information regarding the process. And it was found that there has been a lack of transparency and disclosure of information related to the NAP process. In most cases, there's no clear timeline that was published on official government website. Although in Thailand, actually, the draft NAP was actually made available on the ministry's website. But in Indonesia, according to the information that I received, even until now, the draft was not made public, although there's an information that the government of Indonesia is really wants to launch the national strategy before the end of this year. But again, I haven't seen any development, because I know that civil society really pushed for more consultations because of their concerns with regard to the current state of the draft. And then one of the issue also in terms of the drafting process is also about the lack of a national baseline assessment. In in Thailand, actually, there's no NBA or national baseline assessment. Actually, the national baseline assessment was done by civil society organization. It was actually led by Manusia Foundations as well as the Thai BHR network. In Indonesia, however, there were two baselines conducted by governments, but particularly looking at two specific sectors, which are mining as well as plantation. And then the process actually engaged representatives from civil society, business corporations, business associations or industry, as well as other government officials. And then the questions, another important question that we ask also is about to what extent civil society have been involved in the process. In general, actually, civil society were able to participate in various consultations. However, many also mentions that such consultations were mainly organized in capital, and invitations were sent out to targeted organizations, making the consultation process a process that was not accessible, especially to all affected communities. And with regard to the issues of concerns, I could see that at least there are three common key issues of concerns in countries in Southeast Asia that have developed or are in the process of developing NAPs, which are land grabs, gender equality, and human rights defenders. According to our database, actually...
excuse me, Ms. Yolanda, please wrap up your reflection.
Okay, sorry. So I just wanted to conclude by saying that looking at our own data, we could see that at least in Southeast Asia, top three issues, including freedom of association, environmental related issues, land grabs, and in violations of indigenous people's rights, and specifically in the context of the protections of human rights defenders, actually this is a very important issue that should be part of the National Action Plan on Business and Human Rights. And we can see that being included in the Thai NAP, but I haven't seen this issue being included in other drafts of the NAP, either in Indonesia, in India, or in other Asian countries. So I will stop there, and I'm happy to elaborate further during the question and answer session. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Yolanda. For the participant, we are open to the question where you can type your question in the chat box where we can lead it to the discussion later on. And for the first reflection, I really agree. I really surprised actually by the fact that the gap of the communication between the government section and also the CSO are still missing. And as you mentioned earlier. So next, I would like to invite Mr. Thomas.
Good afternoon to everyone. I'm pleased to join you. I represent the ASEAN CSR network. We are a network formed as an ASEAN entity to promote responsible business conduct in Southeast Asia. And I've been involved in this business and human rights as doing the baseline report in 2014 for the ASEAN Intergovernmental Commission on Human Rights, and also worked on a regional strategy for CSR human rights. And Edmund was was a great supporter in this drive, and I'm pleased to see all that. I would do my presentation. I've done the chapter and just talk about 4 points. One is why link business and human rights, and the other one about NAP, some reflections and some of the features that are happening and some suggestions going forward. Number one, businesses are economic and enterprise that can generate jobs, wealth, income, innovate. They are very good. So when countries want to have job creation, want to create wealth, they attract businesses to come to their countries. And in order to attract the countries compete by lowering environmental standards, labor standards, and other standards even tax, so that they can generate more profits and they will come. So this has resulted into a large extent a race to the bottom because countries compete to lower standards so that businesses, MNCs can increase. The reason is also because the measure of success for business enterprise is the profits they make, the amount of money they make. So profits does. So the mindless pursuit of profits and GDP growth has got a lot of side effects, which has resulted in exploitation of people, exploitation of resources, to environmental degradation, corruption, and you can make a whole list of it. So the pushback for this is standard. So you used to have the old traditional CSR is tick in the box, donate charity and all. But since 2010, there's been a very clear definition that social responsibility is not just philanthropy and charity, it's beyond philanthropy and charity. It is about how you make that money. Is it ethical value? It's not about how you spend your money. It's not about how many churches and temples you build, but how many lives you have improved. So it's immoral to be rich by making other people poorer, whether it's people and environment. And then the whole of human rights is part of this enterprise that you, rather than tick in the box and PR, is to show impact on things. So the UN Guiding Principles of Business and Human Rights has got very clear guidelines. National action plans is basically to implement it. Why? As you said, business organizations has no interest because they are still wanted. It is like a beautiful woman being courted by many suitors, so they can pick and choose. But there's a pressure. So you find that they are there, but it is there. And you find that even in the Southeast Asia, the business involvement, they are more interested in keeping the voluntary mechanisms rather than regulatory mechanisms in place. So all the while, businesses, that has been a tradition. When Bhopal had problems, they came up with responsible or chemicals industry came out with some responsible code. They call self-regulations. So to a large extent, self-regulation. And there are, but could it be more? The features that is also very clear about this thing is that the NEPS is not being pushed by businesses. It's civil society, and in almost all the 3 countries that it's doing is national human rights institutions. Without national human rights institutions, they cannot. But in the NEPS, final NEPS, it's not sure even in Thailand, how is the role of national human rights institutions in furthering that. I think that's. The other one is NEPS have been pushed, and where businesses come to governments, it's economic pressures. If you look at Thailand, the yellow card and the red card helped the whole process. And I think this is also for Malaysia, Indonesia, there is economic reasons to have NEPS. It helps their image, it helps them. And I think another notable absentee in this whole process in terms of involvement, actually is trade unions. If you look at the UN Guiding Principles of Business and Human Rights, they only mention 2 solid instruments. One is the UN Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the ILO Fundamental Principles and Rights at Work. In 1998, this ILO Declaration of Fundamental Principles was come into being, and they reported on every country, whether they rectify the conventions or don't rectify the conventions. So it means that every MNC, every company has to implement the conventions, regardless of whether the country has rectified it or not. But yet, you find that over the last 20 over years, there are gaps on it. And we look at almost all the Southeast Asian has chapters on labor. But lacking in these labor things, you will find that the freedom of association, the right to collective bargaining is absent there. So I think this NEPS is also very clearly on the question of power relationship as well. And as threats to power relationship, it could be seen there. The other point that is worth is, in Europe and many parts of the world, the social responsibility movement, responsible business, was moved by consumer pressure. In Southeast Asia, we don't see that consumer pressure there as such. Or the CSOs generally are quite, they're not able to flourish as in many other countries. So, and the relatives. So I think the way forward, I would say, is that you cannot take business and human rights in isolation. When the ASEAN CSR Network and ASEAN Intergovernmental Commission on Human Rights tried to move human rights in ASEAN by talking about responsible business, CSR, I think we were criticized, but it's still going back. I think you cannot talk to people in isolation that I'll pick and choose operate in silos. A responsible business will respect human beings as much as they respect the environment, as much as they respect their rights to pay taxes, fair taxes, and have good governance. It's a whole thing. But you can start in some places. So in us 26,000, there's 7 subject areas. You can start. You can not pick and choose, but they ask you to look at what is material for you and prioritize on action. So I think this is the point of it. So the overall responsibility, and even for human rights due diligence, is actually responsible business due diligence. So I think we are vindicated by our role in Archer to talk about responsible business as such things. And I think the other point is to move forward, there must be, the Ruggie calls it the smart mix. You need regulations, because without regulations, things doesn't work as such. But regulations in ASEAN has been very good. I mean, my 2014 report says that all the countries have good regulations, but not implemented. A lot of places. Why is it not implemented? Because it's power relationship, there's corruption, and a whole lot of things. So I think the other one is the political will of government leadership. When there is political will, things do move. And so I think the other feature that we have in the region is the EU moving to due diligence on human rights, Green Deal, the US talking about worker-centered trade, and China that has come up with the human rights action plan, and which business and human rights stands there as one of those solid features, and they talk about respect. So I think, but ASEAN does not have its own policy statements. And ASEAN countries are so varied that we actually, although we are in one community, in some ways we also compete with each other for investments and attractions. So I think the way forward is greater ASEAN cooperation, bring in labor. You see, the ASEAN has a CSR standard guidelines on labor, which is trying to talk about labor, but implementation has been poor. And if you look at our Convention on Freedom of Associations, out of the 10 countries, only 4 has ratified it. On collective bargaining, 6 is ratified. Even with rectification, it doesn't mean that the rights of workers has been respected. And fundamental about business and human rights is treating your own employees fairly and treating the community you work fairly, being a good neighbor. That is the best basic essence of business and human rights. Being a good employer, being a good neighbor. And I think I think I'll pause here because and we do the question and answer, because there's a lot more to cover, and I will just pause it. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Thomas. I can see that from your point of view, it's really simple that when the country really need to accumulate wealth or to start to create jobs in the country, at the end, they just invite the business group or the foreign investor to invest in by, have a one eye turn away from the basic rights regarding the labor law or the environmental standard. And also, I'm really surprised that ASEAN actually doesn't have any policy standard regarding this issue, comparing to what you mentioned, the Green Deal in EU or the Human Rights Action Plan that actually have the business and human rights.
Sorry, could I just clarify one thing? I think the ASEAN CSR Network and the ASEAN Business Advisory Council, we are trying to fill that gap by having a code and trying to get companies to sign up for an ASEAN Responsible Inclusive Business Alliance. But we are not very successful because there is not much incentive for people to be responsible.
Okay. So I would like to, before we move to it, I would like to leave a question that is it the nature of ASEAN itself that we doesn't have the intervention or the consensus issue that makes things move slower than it's supposed to be to you in terms of business and human rights? Maybe we can discuss about this later on. So next we have Mr. Edmund Bond, please.
Thank you, Husai. Thank you, Asia Center and FNF for inviting me just to share my comments. I associate myself with a lot of the comments by Betty and Thomas, and I don't want to repeat a lot of these comments. I just wanted to share a bit of how we as a law firm have analyzed the NAPs, as well as when working with companies, looked at how we can implement BHR in a more long-term sustainable way, and then give some thoughts as to the book. It's an excellent publication that I read yesterday, and I want to add on to some of the common features of NAP as well as the lessons we can learn from what some other countries have done. On my part, as Thomas has mentioned, I was on the ICHA, and even before that, we were looking at how we could talk a bit more about human rights in businesses. I've acted for membership organizations, human rights organizations, NGOs, in doing verification and evaluation, as well as in mediation of corrective action plans. So a lot of times, my work deals with getting to the root cause of the problems, doing investigations, and the aftershocks. How does the company, how does the member and buyers want to get the shocks corrected? So I think what we have been doing on my part has been to look at how companies can comply a bit more. And I think there was a news article in Malaysia today, the director saying, the board of the overarching board for directors saying that, the Institute for Directors saying that actually a lot of directors want to comply, but they don't know how to. And I think that's one point that I want to make very quickly. There is a large gap in terms of what we are doing in advocacy, but not actually providing the nitty-gritty tools for the operationalization of matters like human rights due diligence and assessment, as well as communication and tracking. That's the first point. The second point I want to make is that if you look at all the national action plans on business and human rights globally, and I've taken a sample from the US, the United Kingdom, France, and Thailand, there are certain common features that we will identify. So the good things are that you see the 3 pillars of the UNGPs repeated in all the NAPs. The US NAP actually is quite unique because there are some thematics which they break down into, such as leading by example, collaborating with stakeholders, facilitating responsible business, recognizing positive performance, and providing access to remedy. So I think that language, I think in all the NAPs we see is quite good. We also see, secondly, the state commitments to protect against adverse business-related human rights impacts in supply chains. So I think that there are different tools, and some countries like UK and Australia have got the Modern Slavery Act. US uses bilateral and multilateral diplomacy tools to get that committed. So again, I think that's quite good. And of course, I think thirdly, the states have committed themselves where there are NAPs to the UNGPs. Fourthly, there is a lot of promotion of human rights due diligence in all the NAPs. But, and I think this is a very important point, it is still not enough because the promotion relies on companies doing it merely voluntarily. There is no compulsion to do it. And we know what's happening in France. We know what's happening in the EU about trying to get mandatory due diligence across But that one key lesson I wanted to say is that, in Southeast Asia, if we are talking about real and effective NAP, we've got to get human rights due diligence mandatory. We cannot leave it to the companies and corporations to do it voluntarily. The fifth common feature that I've seen is that the NAPs identify correctly the government organizations to implement the initiatives. Six, there is stakeholder participation, but I agree that when we talk about civil society participation, there's a real lack of consultation or genuine consultation. So we have tokenism, we have civil society groups and NGOs invited, businesses invited, but whether and to what extent their comments and inputs are taken into account is another question. There is a ladder of participation from the lowest tokenism, from just giving lip service to stakeholder participation, to true genuine partnership right at the top. Even if you look at the Thai NAP process, there was quite a lot of pushback, and rightly so, by civil society. The Thai BHR Network, Manusha Foundation made public statements about the Thai process that could have been better. Seventhly, I think there is the nature of the NAPs which are subjected to periodic updates and amendments, but really no concrete moves in the particular NAP as to how monitoring and evaluation is done. There is transparency in the way that inputs can be provided. I think that's my 8th point in the NAP. So there will be normally emails or normally ways where you can write and talk about the NAPs and whether it's good or bad. Number 9, there is some identification of human rights risks in businesses we see in the NAPs, but we do not see national baseline assessments being summarized or published in the NAPs. In fact, to me, national baseline assessments, the NBAs, are really the most critical part of any NAP process. If you talk about what the NAP should come up with, recommendation you come up with, it can only be justified if people, citizens, civil society know what the government acknowledges are the gaps in the implementation of UNGPs, and that really comes with the NBAs. So I can see that the US, I can see that countries like the US and the UK did not do their NBAs, and as Betty mentioned, the Thai BHR network actually did their own NBA through regional dialogues, and there you can see the 4 or 5 thematics that CSO did in their independent assessment. The same words are actually carried over in the Thai NAP. Whether that was done intentionally or whether that was done because the government did not do their NBA and had to rely on the independent CSO's NBA is another, I'm not sure. But it looks like if there was only the Thai independent CSO assessment of the NBA and government didn't do one, then we can see the influence civil society had on the Thai NAP, but it's not a good move forward. Fortunately, Malaysia is committed to the NBA process in terms of the 3 thematics, governance, labor, and environment. And civil society, just yesterday, we were just trying to mobilize resources as to how we can shadow that kind of NBA. The other, I think my 10th point was that the access to remedies are not as detailed as they ought to. So I think the pillar 3 and pillar 3 is actually the worst performing pillar in, I think, what we see in terms of the companies in Malaysia. When we did training for 100 over companies on the stock exchange, and we asked them about the work, that how they operationalize access, judicial and non-judicial access to remedies, really the 3rd pillar is the weakest. So the NAPs as well do not focus sufficiently on the 3rd pillar. And my final point on the features of the NAP is that if you look at the NAPs, it's always government responsibility. So you look at the NAPs, it's always about pillar 1, about the state having to do something, having to intervene by making a new law or protecting human rights defenders, or making improving the laws. But if you look at the NAPs, your pillar 2 is actually completely absent. Because human rights activists, civil society groups, or even BHR people are, I think, so focused on legislative change, which is important, I accept. But there is really little emphasis on what companies should do or ought to do, apart from the voluntary measures, apart from the feel-good measures. And you can see that from the NAPs that I've analyzed. Companies just don't have anything to do until and unless, and they get very excited until and unless, when they get very excited when government says, okay, I'm going to impose something, some legislative change. So I think that the gap for Pillar 2 in terms of the NAPs are quite large. There are some differences as well on the NAPs. We see some NAPs that deal with extraterritorial activities, but we don't see that in some of the NAPs. As I mentioned as well, some NAPs have done MBAs while some have not. So I just wanted to leave it there for the moment. I see that there is a very rich discussion about the problems and challenges of the NAP development in the Asia Center's report. I'm very happy that it's been documented and it's given a lot of food for thought. It gives an opportunity as well for civil society and interested stakeholders to, and especially in Malaysia as we are processing the NBA, to actually use in our advocacy and to actually learn from some of the lessons that have been passed. Finally, I want to again end by saying, while there are some companies that are horrendous in business and human rights, there are some companies, I think, and minority, of course, who would not just blindly chase profit and would say, yeah, I want to do more of the S, more of the E in the ESGs, but I do not know how to do it. And I think the next stage or the next generation of advocacy really should focus on more of the micro aspects of the operationalization of what kind of tools do we use, or how do companies get your due diligence done in a simple way, just as a thing where I do not need to put in a lot of resources. Perhaps that kind of discourse and advocacy is necessary in the human rights arena. And you can just reach out to anyone. I've asked a lot of people, hey, how do you do this? You know, if a company asks you, how do you do this? It's very difficult to say, yeah, we know how to do this. It's very easy to say, yeah, you have to make sure you do human rights due diligence, get the 5 steps done. Then the question becomes, how do we do? Where do we start? I just want to leave it here, leave my sharing here with that kind of question. Thank you, Husai.
Thank you, Edmund. It's really important that we have to look into the national baseline assessment or the NBA itself in the NAPs. And I also agree with your last point regarding the situation where the business organization itself doesn't know what to do to protect or to do. When you mentioned the remedy, the access to remedies or the worker itself, there are still missing gap and missing information that we need to be provided towards the business organization itself in order to support the human rights protection regarding the business. And also, I can see that the gap of advocacy and the not enough information to communicate to the business is also the main point that we need to look into it. Before we going into the discussion, I would like to welcome Mr. Sau Takahashi you have a floor.
Thank you very much. I actually have a presentation. I don't know if you could give me the co-host rights, and then I can share the presentation. Is that possible?
Yes.
Right. Okay, good. Now it's done. So let's see. Right. Okay. Good. I'm just gonna get this up here. Oh dear. Hold on a second. It's rebooting. I don't know what happened there. This is the problem when we rely on these technical things. All right, now it should be okay. It's opening again. Can you see this or can you not see it?
Not yet.
Not yet. Okay. Try again. And if it doesn't work this time, then we'll just give up and I'll just talk without the slides. Okay, now it should be right.
Okay.
Okay, now you see it. Now you see it, now you don't. Now you see it. Okay, so that's all right. So terribly sorry about that. Yes, so thanks very much for this opportunity. I'm teaching full-time right now at Osaka Jogakuin University, which is a very small women's university in central Osaka. But I used to be the Japan representative for the Business and Human Rights Resource Center in Japan. So I worked a lot with Japanese companies trying to get them to strengthen their human rights efforts and also publishing information, as has already been said, positive and negative about human rights, business and human rights issues in Japan. Also, I did quite a bit of work together with Japanese companies in several Southeast Asian countries, mainly Thailand, but also Malaysia and to a lesser extent Myanmar, holding workshops, getting them together with stakeholders in those respective countries because they had very extensive supply chains there. So I do have a general understanding of what's going on in Southeast Asia. I left the Business and Human Rights Resource Center in early 2019, and that's when I started teaching. But I'm, of course, still doing research on business and human rights. One of the very good, but in a way difficult things about going last in these kind of things is that now pretty much everything's already been said. I will talk mainly from a Japanese perspective, but there are a lot of parallels with what's going on, of course, in Southeast Asia, and I think in a lot of other countries in the world as well. I have a few slides introducing the Business and Human Rights Research Center, but of course, it's already been done by Betty, a previous speaker. And the other thing is, I'm sort of assuming that most of the people here are familiar with the Business and Human Rights Research Center, so I won't take too much time on that. It is really the main information hub for information on business and human rights. So anybody doing any kind of research on the topic, I'm sure is already using it, and do please check it out. One of the things that we do, or I still say we, so you see, the Research Center, one thing that I did when I worked at the Research Center is, of course, always go to companies before publishing information that other NGOs or journalists had compiled on particular companies. We would always go to that particular company and ask for a response to the reports, to the allegations, if you like. This is generally very successful. I'm not sure what the response rate is right now, but generally over 70% globally. Of the time that we go to companies, the companies come back with some semblance of a response. Those responses are just sort of slopped into a PDF and they're put on the website together with the initial report from other NGOs or from the media or whatever. So all of those are put in there. And if you go to the website, you can actually download this kind of spreadsheet and you can filter it looking at, so you want to say, okay, I want to see all the instances, all the cases where Japanese car companies were asked to respond or did not respond. So for example, if a company refuses to respond or doesn't get back to us by the deadline, then that's also put on the website saying they did not respond. So, you can download the spreadsheet, which is updated automatically in real time. It's quite fantastic. So it is definitely a very good source of information on these kind of issues. Now, when I was working in the business and human rights area, when I started out, this was 2014, I had left the UN and I had come back to Japan. And one of the things that, a lot of people were talking about, and I think a lot of people still talk about, is what's often called the better for business or the good for business argument. That we as advocates would go to companies and tell them, we would show them, look, if you can show consumers and governments and everybody that you are, making really serious efforts to protect human rights, or excuse me, to respect human rights, then that will actually be good for your business. You will be, you can brand yourself as a very good company, a good global citizen, and that will lead to more profits for you. That sounded good to me at the time. And so, I got my presentations, I got all the information that I could, and I went to these companies and I was doing these presentations. I found out very quickly that this just didn't work. And I'd be very interested to hear, if anybody has different experiences, but certainly with the Japanese companies that I went to, this was just not going to fly. I think there are a number of different reasons for that, but, and from their perspective, perhaps they were good reasons, but the fact of the matter is it just didn't work. I mean, the lack of information available to make this kind of case is very, very scarce. The published information tends to focus on resource extraction companies and really only specific cases. So the companies I found, even doing resource extraction in Japan, they would always have a reason why it was a different situation. There would always be some kind of excuse why it wasn't exactly the same as what they wanted to do. And that excuse, that was a good excuse why they didn't have to listen to me. So that just didn't work. I think also they found it generally insulting that this notion that this nobody from some kind of puny NGO would come to them, a brand name Japanese company, and show them that show them how to run their business. I think they were sort of insulted by this notion. So it just didn't work. And as I was doing these presentations, I started realizing, why am I doing this anyway? I mean, why should I be begging these people to do something that they should be doing in any case? Obviously, I understand they're not states; they don't have a direct obligation under international law to do this kind of thing. But regardless, they should be doing this. And why is it that we should be going? That I have to be going to these company people, these jerks, and going to tell them, look, please, it would be better for you. It would be better for you if you only listen to me. It just started to seem a little bit ridiculous. The other thing is that companies also came to me. They would also tell me, truthfully or not, that they wanted a level playing field, i.e. they would say, yeah, okay, human rights, fair and, all that's fine and well, and we're kind of interested, but look, we're looking at costs. We're looking at increased costs. You can't deny that's the case. So if it's something, if we throw these costs in, we do these expenses, then that means that our competitors are going to have a leg up on us, which is, from their perspective, a reasonable argument, I suppose. And they would come to me and say, look, it's got to be the government. The government's got to come to us and make us do it. They've got to adopt a regulation saying we've all got to do this, like with the environment. And then we have a level playing field. Then we're all at the same, we're all in the same boat. We all have to abide by the regulation. So we all have to pay for that kind of thing. So, all of this together really sort of made it crystallize in my mind, in my opinion, that there really is a need for binding regulation. This is the kind of I think our previous speakers pretty much have all said this. We need a smart mix. We need measures to encourage companies to do this, et cetera, et cetera. But we need binding regulation. We need governments to force companies to do this. Otherwise, it's just not going to work. And I think the whole international discourse has definitely moved in that direction very clearly. Now, just as background, Japan is a very sort of all carrot and no stick country. The 2020 Olympics, which of course didn't work out so well anyway, but the fact that was going to be held in Japan became the big driving force behind a lot of interest in business and human rights. I mean, companies were really falling all over themselves, saying, okay, we've got to do this. We've got to at least show that we're trying to do this kind of human rights stuff, because there's going to be a lot of scrutiny, there's going to be a lot of attention. As I said, the Olympics didn't really work out so well, but the point is that if anything, that was a good legacy that the Olympics has left with the business environment here in Japan. Definitely, it's been the driving force behind a lot of increased interest in this, at least with the big companies. On the government side, however, it remains the case that there's just a big reluctance to impose binding restrictions on companies. We're full of these voluntary approaches and sort of fancy certification schemes that, have these kind of cutesy little certification little logos that you get. But if you really sort of look into them and look and see what companies really have to do, it's very little. And there's very little to these. So I don't think we have time to really go through all of these, the 3 human rights issues that I have focused, that I put here, but women's rights in the workplace, extremely long working hours, which lead to karoshi, our word for death from overwork, all these kind of things. You have these fancy certifications, they really mean very little. I mean, they haven't done, frankly, they've been very ineffectual. The import of illegally felled timber, mainly from Malaysia, also same thing. So, this really is, in my mind, Japan's a very strong argument for the need for binding regulation, how these voluntary schemes simply don't do enough. Now, Japan did adopt a NAP in late October 2020. Civil society had been calling for this for many years. So it was in many ways, civil society pushed the government into doing it. But it was a surprise announcement. I think it was the 2017 forum in Geneva where the government representative all of a sudden said it out of the blue, and we were like, wow, well, what's going on now? We always pointed to the fact that Japan was almost the last in the G7. It remains the second to last. Canada is the last country that hasn't done it. But so we were definitely one of the last to adopt a NAP, but it was adopted. There was a consultation sort of process with ILO and also with NGOs, but it was, I call it lackluster here. The word tokenism has been said by a previous speaker. I don't know if I'd call it completely ineffectual, but it was definitely select NGOs. In all fairness to them, I think they did make an effort to select the right people. But regardless, it was them doing the selecting. I think we would go to them and say, well, what about these people, those people, and those people? And they would generally be open to that, but it was them. They were the ones deciding whom they were going to invite. The entire consultation process was very rushed. It certainly did not appear to me to be that effective in the sense that, we would go and present things, but they weren't really reflected. So as a result, the NAP is there, and it's also in English. You can see it, but there's really very little to it. There are basically no new initiatives. There are no big ideas. I mean, it's, as I've written here, furthering IT-based access to civil courts. This is nothing. This is nonsense. Human rights training for Japanese police. Oh, it's nice to know that they weren't doing it anyway. So, all these kind of things, which really are not, there's just not much to it. I haven't looked at the Thai NAP in great detail, I must admit, but certainly just a cursory examination shows that, frankly, it's much better. Whether it'll be implemented as advertised, this is something I don't know, but certainly the Thai NAP has goals, action points, timeframes, all these kind of things, which the Japanese NAP simply doesn't have. Since the NAP, there is a semblance of follow-up on the part of the government. There's been an interagency committee was formed. It says that explicitly in the NAP. So that has been formed to monitor implementation of the NAP. Now, there's only been one meeting up till now that took place in July. It was essentially a sort of show and tell exercise where people from the different ministries said, oh, well, these are the kind of things that, these are the kind of laws that have been adopted in the last period. They had to come with something, so many of the things that they present are frankly not so relevant. And then after having this sort of government show and tell thing, they asked ILO and the select NGOs, select civil society groups, to give them their 2 cents. And so that was that, and then the meeting was closed. At this point, I can't really say it's truly effective participation on the part of NGOs. Whether that will change from now, we have to see. We have to see what happens from the second meeting onwards. The government also conducted a survey of major companies on their human rights policies and due diligence. Now, I have this is from their website, the government website. I have a graph of, as you can see, of the percentage of companies that responded to this survey by industry. I didn't have time to translate this into English, but as you can see, it's pretty pathetic no matter what. The manufacturing industry had 57.4% response. The others are just like, it's not even worth looking at it. Now, if the government comes to a company and says, we really expect a response with this, I can assure you they're going to do it. So this pathetic response rate to me tells me that the government did not do that. The government just didn't take it seriously. I do not blame this on the companies, frankly. I think this is the government's responsibility for not giving a clear message to companies that this was a serious endeavor that they expected companies to take seriously. Anyway, so that's where we are with that. The government also produced a sort of best practices report of the leading companies, 14 large, there were a couple of SMEs thrown in, and these companies are in all fairness, they're mostly the leading companies amongst the Japanese companies, the ones that have tended to take serious measures in human rights. Also, Keidanren, the big Japanese major big business association, published just the other day, published a handbook on implementing human rights. Well, again, we'll see how seriously that's done. Now, one, I don't know if I want to say interesting, but one thing, of course, one big thing that happened, of course, in the beginning of this year was Myanmar and the coup in Myanmar. This was a big opportunity for Japanese companies and the government to show that they would walk the walk of human rights and not just, talk the talk and leave it at that. I think it's fair to say in general, well, this is my opinion, that they dropped the ball. A small number of Japanese companies, I think one pulled out of all the investments that it had with the military. But in general, I think the government as well, and the companies were actually kind of surprised that NGOs were coming to them and saying, okay, so now what? What are you going to do? This is your chance to show us that you're taking this seriously. And it was pretty clear that most of the companies figured, okay, we have these human rights policy statements, we have these glossy brochures, and now now everything's fine. They weren't expected to be called on it. They weren't expected. They hadn't been expecting NGOs and civil society to come to them and say, okay, now we expect you to translate your words into action. So there's a lot of sort of faffing about and inaction. There's a very, what I note, an arrogant narrative.
Give me Mr. Tao, please.
Yes. Yes. Okay, I'll finish.
Before we go into it.
Yes. So there's a little bit of improvement in recent months, I would say, on the part of companies, but we have to see. Now, one big thing that's really happened over the past, the past month or so, is that the government has started announcing that it's going to take this business and human rights seriously, and it expects companies to do the same. I think there are two main things behind this. They see this as a way to get an advantage over China, which China being the big boogeyman in the country for anything and everything that goes wrong here. The other thing is, I think they also believe that it's a better for business thing, that somehow they will be able to brand Japanese companies as opposed to Chinese companies and Korean companies as good global citizens. So we have to see. I mean, that's really been over the past couple of weeks. So nothing really has happened. We have to see whether there will actually be sticks or whether it'll just be another carrot, and whether it will be universally applied or just only in companies that are doing business in China. We have to see. So I'll just skip that. I had some advertisements for my books, but anyway, that's it. And thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Takahashi. It's a great comparison that we can get to see the nature of the NAP implementation in Japan itself, where you mentioned that it's really important that most of the business company tend to expect the government action regarding the binding regulation, or the way that so SEOs regard that they want the government to come into them, giving them order itself.
Sorry, I missed that.
Or the civil society part.
I'm sorry, I didn't. I think you were sort of going in and out there. Did you? Were you asking me something?
Sorry, I think we lost you for two or three minutes.
Husai, can you hear us? I think Husai may. Okay, I think he has a problem with the connection. I mean, let's continue while Husai rejoins.
Okay, I'm here.
Oh, there you are. Okay.
Sorry from the connection.
Please go ahead.
that I don't know that where the last that it left off, but I want to start with the question that, to Dr. Takahashi, that is it the Japanese are in the culture that they tend to, rely on the government to, take action, to give them order instead of listening to the NGOs. Is it really common in other sectors as well, or it's just the business and human rights sector?
Well, this is kind of a big question, which I think might not be, I might not have a quick answer to. I'm generally skeptical of being a lawyer, I'm generally skeptical of arguments based on quote unquote culture. I think that there is a general notion amongst big Japanese companies that they want the government to take the lead. I think that's not so much that they want to be told what to do, but more that they want the government to take responsibility when things go wrong. But certainly, when companies come and say, we want a level playing field, I know that I have scholar friends who are also very skeptical of this, but I think there is something to that. And I think they are being honest when they say that. I mean, I think they, when they say we want everybody to have the same start line, then that's a legitimate thing to say.
Okay, yeah, I really agree when it comes to that. While we are waiting for the question from the participant today, we also have the questions that the registrants actually sent it to us during the registration period. I might start with one or two questions, then directing to our speaker. The first one would be, does the business sector take the business and human rights agenda seriously, or are they happy with the CSR only? Maybe I can direct it to Mr. Thomas and maybe Betty.
Thank you. I would basically say the CSR, as you know, about philanthropy and charity has moved on. That philanthropy was voluntary, about philanthropy or voluntary. I think nobody today talks about CSR as voluntary. You look at the EU definition of CSR. It used to be beyond rules and regulations of voluntary. Today it's just the impactance of business on society. So that's number one. Number two, I think it's also a peer. Sustainability is the in thing today. It's a flavor of the month. I remember in 2018 when I did a survey on CSR in Singapore. I mean, the government agreed to do a survey because I tried talking to them to check these things they did. And governments in my country, they tell you to do a survey, they ask you a survey, you better do it. Otherwise, it's $5,000 fine or 6 months jail. And you better tell the truth because otherwise you're also in trouble. They got 100% response rate. But 60% of the companies had never heard of CSR. And out of the 40% who said they heard it, 2/3 said, I heard it, but I'm not doing anything. You ask them why they are not doing anything, because I don't know what to do. I don't have time. I don't have money. And most important, my government never tell me to do. So we're also a very obedient people like the Japanese. The other 1/3 said, yes, I'm doing CSR. It's about philanthropy and charity. I do giving back to them. But today you look at all the websites of major companies throughout Asia, there is a whole lot of stories. But still, unfortunately, in CSR, if you look at sustainability report, most things they write about their philanthropic activities and economic wealth. I've done this study with the National University of Singapore over the last, I think since 2016. We find the least reported things are human rights, biodiversity, climate change, and business and human rights, and labor standards, employment and labor standards issues are the least reported. So I would just say, yes, CSR has moved on, but not as much as we would like it to.
Sorry, I think Husai has connection has gone for a second. while we wait for Husai to rejoin, Husai, I don't know if you are there. Perhaps I can carry on the conversation with all of you. I would like to come back maybe to a, oh, there you are, Husai, please, please.
I'm so sorry, the internet at the office is
no problem, please go ahead.
Okay,
the floor is yours.
Thank you, Thomas, for your answer. I really agree that when it comes to the CSR, when in Thailand or in Bangkok itself, you can see that, let's say CP, that they have the CSR program by helping building parks and things like that. But at the same time, there was some problem regarding the labor standard or the wage or the working hour situation in Thailand that it really exists, especially when it comes to other, not only in CP, but other business as well, that, the problem with migrant workers and then the undocumented migrant workers, that they are affected, especially during the COVID period. Is really a big situation that's happening right now. Before next, we have the question from the floor, actually. Do you think that the NAP is only a procrastination of abiding regulation and law? And then should the CSO push for abiding regulation, even though there is a lack of law enforcement in the region? Can I state this to Betty?
Yeah, thank you, Husai. I just wanted to comment also on the first questions about CSR. Actually, based on, again, the reflections that we gathered, I will give a concrete example from the experience of the Indonesian process. So our partners said that if we look back at the initiation process, I mentioned about two actors that really push for the NAP. It's government and civil society. According to our partner, actually, businesses in Indonesia, they have not really fully engaged with the issue of business and human rights. Their focus has always been on the issue of CSR, as well as their ability to ensure their contributions to the achievement of the 2030 agenda. They don't really see the NAP as a vehicle to also help them to achieve their contributions to the Sustainable Development Goals. And then the second question is about whether the NAP is only a procrastination of a binding regulation. I think this has been mentioned by other speakers, that we really wanted to make sure that also, given the voluntary nature of the NAP, we really need to ensure that there's a mandatory requirement for companies and private sectors to really conduct human rights due diligence. And that really can also come from the legally binding instrument that is being currently discussed at the UN level.
Okay, thank you. We have a raise of a hand from Mark Ritchie. Please, you can ask question now.
Yes, thank you. I just want to ask some questions. Now, so my first question is for everyone. How do you think digitalization would impact equal opportunity and non-discrimination in businesses, whereas it is digitalization which also widens gap in terms of employee skills? So that's my first question. If you may allow, I will ask some questions. Is it okay? Or later? Sure. Okay, yeah. Sure. My second question is about metrics, because this metrics is really the language of many businesses now, but we're talking of NAPs. So what metrics could you advise for the micro level to complement the macro level, right? How to measure this NAP goals in terms of the micro level, right? So what metrics could you think of? And my last one is, thank you for the indulgence. In some countries in Southeast Asia, there are clashes between business rights and labor rights. So how should government strike a balance, especially where non-unionized business organizations are few? Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mark, for all the three questions. We have the digitalization that where it can be a great equal opportunity, but at the same time, they can widen the gap on the employee. Next, second one, we have the metrics that the micro level can be used to complete the macro level obligation. And lastly, the clashes between business rights and also the labor rights, especially towards the country that doesn't have a union itself. So for the digitalization, maybe Edmund, you want to take the first one?
Thank you for the question. It's a very difficult question because when you talk about digitalization, we need to be quite specific as to what we are talking about. I think when we have on the one hand increased use of digital equipment, so for example to deal with COVID, but we keep giving up our privacy. So immediately that I think one issue that comes to mind is the issue of data breaches and privacy on a voluntary basis. So if we talk about COVID as a good example, when we sign up to something, we're immediately doing that. We're looking at social media again as well. Once you sign up to Facebook or you sign up to Twitter, you are giving up that kind of privacy on that end. But when you talk about digitalization in terms of equal opportunity, in terms of garnering inputs, in terms of hearing more voices, then it's a tool that actually can be used in a progressive manner. So I think we need to be quite focused on that. I'm no expert on pushing for more use of digital equipment. But I think your second question, I think is very important. Your second question as to the matrix. I think I keep saying that we need to remember that the NAP is only a tool to an end. The NAP is not the end in itself. But a lot of civil society groups and a lot of donors think of the NAP as something achievable, something that is more of a low-hanging fruit, because we need it to get governments and companies socialized towards the BHR. I think the reason this NAP thing came about was because people were not socialized towards the issue. And if we look back in the beginning, when this NAP thing was only talked about in terms of really, really new and fresh issues. So when we look at the NAP for BHR, let us not forget that the NAP for BHR is not something that, once it's done 2019 to 2022, 2022, you have a perfect business and human rights record. It's actually a work in progress. And so that's why I think the argument by the working group and OHCHR is to have a smart mix of voluntary and non-voluntary mandatory measures in the NAP, is to allow that kind of room for companies and governments to play around with. However, as I keep looking at different NAPs and analyzing those NAPs, you see that there is actually more voluntary measures than more non-voluntary measures. So when you talk about more voluntary measures, awareness building, building capacity, training, doing a manual, those type of metrics would be the matrix of that product, right? You would have done 10 trainings for 1,000 over people. But when you talk about, we're going to implement this law in the next year, then that law is the matrix. But I think the human rights advocacy for business and human rights is still going to take the same shape as human rights advocacy for any other issue. So companies and governments start sitting up, and I'm talking about Malaysia as well, and getting a shock. They start wanting to do something only when there is an exposure of a forced labor case. So the recent case of the Dyson using a Malaysian EMS manufacturer for electronics. There was a forced labor whistleblowing case, and then it came up, and then the government only starts panicking. Dyson cuts the contract, which is not exactly the best thing to do at the moment, but then the company in Malaysia starts to say, okay, these are the remedies that we are taking. That goes hand in hand with the soft touch that a lot of the NAPs have. So in terms of how you want to have a matrix, I'm saying that it's equally important you have that continuous name and shaming, that continuous litigation that goes with the lab. Thank you. Thank you for the question.
Thank you, Edmund. Betty, you want to add on this regarding the metrics?
Sorry, I had an internet issue, but what I heard was the first questions about digitalization.
Okay,
Can I respond to that?
Yeah, sure.
So last year, Business and Human Rights Resource Center, we organized a close strategic discussion on 3 key issues in the context of labor rights in the sector of agriculture and fishery, and also with regard to the care economy as well as the gig economy. So what was really discussed, and then the key takeaway from that discussion was that while playing a crucial role in creating new income generating opportunities, online platforms, what we are seeing now as the future of work in terms of digitalization, are considered to do more harms than good to workers. Because in a data-driven economy, labor and workers' rights are being extracted. And the legal challenges now is with regard to the classifications of workers in the gig economy as independent or self-employed contractors. One of the recommendations that came from that discussion, which is to me is very much relevant to the context of the development of NEP, is with regard to regulatory framework, because the recommendation really highlights the need to establish a regulatory framework on the gig economy to strengthen and expand the existing social protection system to include all workers. And the process should also take into consideration the workers' view to ensure that such a framework really responds to the needs, the specific needs of the workers, particularly online platform workers. So just to respond to that.
Okay, thank you. I think it's really important when we need to look into the digitalization itself. I read the report, and they also mentioned that during the pandemic, that most of the business are looking towards, the AI-driven technology, where it actually caused more harm towards the labor itself. That people will lose more jobs, and the standard, the rights that they have are actually lessened away due to that. So for the last question, the clashes between business rights and labor rights, maybe Mr. Thomas, can you take this one?
I would start off by saying actually there is not really a clash. It's a clash. It's not between the rights, but rather how do you operate to get business, to make more money. I think that's the clash. Traditionally, businesses has full right. They used to, my father's generation used to write to a letter to employee and signed off as your obedient servant. It's part of the feudal system that you're an obedient servant. In my generation, maybe early on, but most of the time we just write yours truly. Now I think we just write sincerely as a friend. So I'm just saying the evolution has changed and it's going back. Labor businesses want total flexibility. With total flexibility, there's no protection. So I think workers want some protection. So the question is within flexibility and protection. If we have too much of protection, it's difficult for business to make money, and it's an obstacle. If you have total flexibility, you cause more harm. It's just like the gig economy. The workers, they have total flexibility, but the guy who sends me some of the things tells me that he has to go and collect the goods at 4 o'clock in the morning, and he pays for his own vehicle, pays for his own transport, and if he's sick, he doesn't earn money. Versus in the protection of social. So I think for us, as advocates of business and human rights, is to say that human beings cannot be treated as a commodity. You cannot, I don't like the term human resource, because when you talk about resource, you are treating human beings as the pump in the factory or the pipe that produces goods. We have to talk about human beings as human beings, that they must have a living wage and a dignity of labor. So if businesses cannot deliver it, so what is the role of government? The role of government is that its job is to look after every citizen. So I think the role of government must be that they should, while businesses must thrive, must generate profits, they cannot do it at the expense of exploiting their own citizens. I think that's basic rule for them. So in the past, there is social security, there's social safety nets. Those has to be universally applied across the board. So I think the role of government is as a rule maker to say there are limits to which you can do. I mean, we need rules, we need regulation. If people who tell me they don't like rules, then they should go to countries like Somalia or somewhere and see whether they can do that. I think when a lot of people say they don't like rules, they don't like rules that hinder them. And with the power balance, they can do a lot more things. So I think the role of government is to create an environment where there are dignity and the interests of everybody is safeguarded.
Thank you so much for your explanation. I think it's really important when you need to measure, the flexibility and the protection itself, where business. I mean, for sure that they actually need a profit. They need to run the business. But at the same time, we have to look at the people as a people. That people have different causes and needs, and we have to protect the basic rights on that. And while we're waiting for the question, I actually have another question before the panel. So why have business entities are not participated or participated very little in the drafting of the NAPs? Anyone want to take that?
Maybe Husai can answer that. I was going to touch on that a little bit. We don't see businesses really that involved in Malaysia, and that's really sad. That's really unfortunate. The discussions regarding NAP and the discussions regarding even voluntary measures with companies, we don't see much of a take-up until and unless government says through the stock exchange, for example, or through the official government body that looks after companies or domestic trade, when they say, okay, we're going to have this type of law made mandatory where you have to file a sustainability statement. So like in Malaysia, the stock exchange, you need to file under practice note 9 a sustainability statement, but the company is left to decide its form and manner it's going to be done, its content. It's not audited, but that's a good start. I think it's just now the push to get those sustainability statements audited, I think, and reviewed and maybe ranked. But apart from that, we have a real problem getting businesses on board. Civil society, so you have a challenge with civil society trying to convince government to become stricter and having more stringent laws. But then when it comes, you have a pushback from businesses to stop that kind of initiative. But before that happens, even if you invite businesses to conferences and webinars, it's very rare that you're going to get them actively participating. So that's a real challenge, and trying to get business associations in Malaysia to come has been a great task. There are some companies, the leading companies that have resources to send people and look at these type of law and policy initiatives, but as a whole, it's a real issue. Thank you.
Thank you, Edmund. Before we
could I just add?
Mr. Thomas, yeah.
I think just to add to what Edmund said, I think if you look at businesses in Southeast Asia, the big businesses, most of them are government linked, the most successful ones, or they are family owned. And these families are also linked to governments. So they have a backdoor or things to get their questions. They have a special audience. So I think that's, I mean, whether in Thailand, for example, I'm just giving example. 2017, I was there when they launched the NAP process. The Ministry of Labour was not involved. The trade unions were not there. It's only they came in later. So I think we must recognize that businesses are given enough free to run the thing. And our government strong enough in our systems to tell businesses what to do. So I think, and I think Betty talked about Indonesia. It's true, in our sustainability reporting, the country that has the least disclosure is Indonesia. Okay, and government, and to reinforce the point of Edmund, when Bosa Malaysia came up with their rules, you know, the Malaysian scores for Malaysian companies went up. So even if it is mild, people are more obedient. The scores comes out. So in terms of integrity, for business integrity, when Malaysians push for integrity schemes or for companies to do, the take-up rate is good. At least they disclose, they move better. So I just want to reinforce the point that governments has a role. I think Amartya Sen said quite nicely. He says the invisible hand of the market actually needs the visible hand of the government. Okay, so there's no such thing as invisible hand. So I think the government's visible hand hopefully NAPs. And that is one of the reasons why the Pillar 2 in most of the NAPs are very mild. And there is no impact. So why should businesses attend when they can carry on with business as usual? And in some of the reports, countries at the ground rules, he said their rules are not going to be changed. The laws are not going to be changed. If the laws are not going to be changed, I carry business as usual for me. So why should I do that? So I think we have to maybe fundamentally change the rules and to encourage him to participate, to change things. I had a previous trade union background. We normally negotiate to get things that is to actually ask to an extreme, say, I want all these things to be changed. And therefore, and then you come in and say, okay, I will moderate. And people are moderate. We talk to them, what are your concerns, and try and address them. So I think we have no one size fit all for all the enterprises. And I attended the Malaysian session once, and I think they're actually hitting the right things, and possibly you'll get more and more people to come on board.
Okay, thank you for your view, Thomas. We actually got a question from Andrew Koo. Actually, the first one got answered by Edmund already. So the second one, that is the Malaysia listed companies are required to provide a statement about CSR, and it is filled with photos of children being given school bags and uniform, and orphans being fed at Idul Adha parties sponsored by the company concerned. There does not seem to be any education or correction about what CSR is. How different will be the sustainability of modern slavery statements? Maybe Edmund, you can explain more about that.
This is why Thomas has to change ASEAN CSR network to ASEAN BHR network. No, but I think you have a brand name there. Andrew, I fully agree with you. But when we did the training for the 100 over stock exchange companies, there's internal shift of mindset, because what happens is when you ask a bit more of a specific question, the immediate thinking changes towards BHR and no longer CSR. So the question in the thematics, meaning the template, if you ask the company, what do you report on in your sustainability statement? So it's called sustainability statement. It's not called a CSR statement. It's not even called a BHR statement, but because it's companies know this ESG thing, so the S in the social, they talk about sustainability statements. You say you will ask them, okay, do you report on forced labor? Do you report on health and safety? Do you report on environment? And then when the thematic question or the conversation is shifted towards those thematic issues, the mindset starts to shift and change. They know that reporting on what you give children, or what you give homes, while it's something that's good for the less fortunate, does not necessarily count as a BHR. So one answer really is to perhaps get Bursa and the Malaysian Companies Commission, which is now having, I think, their own internal discussions whether they should make it voluntary for non-listed companies, because now it's only voluntary, to get them to say in what form, manner, and what type of reporting needs to go into your sustainability statement. I use the example of Australia and UK on the modern slavery statements to show that, I can't remember which of the country, UK or Australia, where if you don't file a statement, the minister can actually request for an explanation. If you don't do that, the minister can actually name and shame the company in the registry. So of course, again, that's not the best, but in terms of reporting, the reporting section, that is a bit faster than getting companies to do real due diligence. The idea really is to get them to do the due diligence to then report it. But I know what you're meaning. Sometimes they just do the reporting for the sake of reporting and not do the proper due diligence assessment and corrective action plans. Thank you.
Thank you, Edmund.
Could I just add a little bit for it?
Yeah, sure.
I've done some studies on these things. I think the key part is the companies are supposed to look at what is material for them, for their business. What is the impact that is material? And they should report on those material things. And Edmund is right that it is not being done properly. But I think if you look at the countries in the region, the Bursa Malaysia actually in their website has got more better quality resource materials than many other stock exchanges. So I think therefore you will look at the quality of reports in Malaysian companies is quite credible. When you look at, but the analysis of materiality and completeness of your report are areas that can be improved. And the other thing is most companies use reports to show how good they are. So you'll find that these many reports does not talk about any adverse effect that they ever got a fine on. It's all good and glossy. So I think that affects credibility. So I think we need to, the Global Reporting Initiative is updating their reporting standards. And many of the countries, most of our companies in our region use GRI. And I hopefully there'll be more change then on the way, as long as they use materiality and completeness and principled approach.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Thomas. As our organizer mentioned that we will go to the closing remarks in 5 minutes, maybe I would like to ask all speakers maybe giving like 1 or 2 minutes of the closing statements for the today panel discussion, if possible. Maybe start with Sao Chakaji.
Okay, thank you very much. At the beginning of the session today, we all inputted this poll, and I actually answered on the poll that I believed that most companies were just doing it for lip service. But I do want to say, I don't think that's the end of the world, because I've seen the same thing with governments as well. Most governments that sign on to human rights treaties, they're not interested in changing anything. They're not interested in, changing the way they do things. They're just interested in it as sort of promotional thing that they can go to the UN and say, see, look, we're one of the guys now. But once you create that kind of thing, once you sign on to a treaty, you have to create a framework, and then you have to do this and do the next thing. And then, a certain momentum is created. That's what I believe. And I think that's what at least some of the research shows. And I think, and I certainly hope that we will see the same thing with companies. So, I want to leave on a not a cynical note. I want to say that I think that a lot of what companies do in terms of these human rights statements and, sustainability reports, all this kind of thing, most of it is lip service, at least in the minds of the company people that are creating them. But I don't think that's the end of the world, because I think that as time goes by and as, a younger generation, they start, you know, they will, in Japan, it's already happening. They're choosing the company they want to work for, partially on the basis of their human rights record and this kind of, you know, the CSR stuff and all this kind of stuff. So I think that, you know, it creates a momentum that will definitely lead to something more substantive change down the road. So on that relatively optimistic note, I want to leave that. Thank you.
Thank you, Sal. Maybe Betty?
Yes, thanks, Husai. I just have 4 final points. So the first one, again, going back to the importance of developing a national baseline assessment. I think this should be a step that cannot be missed by government when developing a national action plan, as it shows the government how to address most pressing governance gaps as well as most pressing human rights issues in the country. The second thing is about inclusive and meaningful participations and engagement of all stakeholders, particularly civil society and affected communities, because this should be also one of the priorities of the government in terms of the process. And then the third issue would be about integrating gender, because this is something that has been missing in most of the national action plan, because at least taking the example of the Thai NAP, one of the criticisms has been that the NAP has yet to also include or discuss the challenges by women and LGBTI individuals, not only with regard to the whole issue of visibility and human rights, particularly in accessing remedies, as well as decision-making processes, particularly in the context of land-related issues, environmental rights, as well as the management of natural resources. And then the last and the fourth point would be, when we come to the stage of implementation, I think it should be very clear that the implementation should not be a top-down process. And it should not only involve governments and businesses, but also civil society as well as communities. Because again, looking at the reflections that we get from civil society partners during the implementations, apparently affected communities as well as civil society organizations are being left out of the process. So this means that if this is the case, then accountability in the implementations or monitoring of the NEP will be questionable. So again, so those 4 issues in terms of the NBA, and then inclusive, meaningful, and participations and engagement, gender integration, as well as ensuring that the implementations of the NEP will not be a top-down process. Thank you.
Thank you, Betty. Okay, then due to the restraint of time, maybe Mr. Thomas and then Edmund.
I would basically say, number one, that this whole journey of CSR is a journey, and human rights is a journey. And to this journey, we have to do certain things to reinforce. I agree with Edmund that my own organization, we have this name called ASEAN CSR Network, but we have an initiative which calls the ASEAN Responsible and Inclusive Business Alliance. So it's to reinforce that message as well. But against the journey, sometimes you take 2 steps forward and 3 steps back, and then you move forward. So we need to have these whole mechanisms to reinforce the right behavior and reinforce the incentive to keep moving forward and not backwards. And for that, we can't depend on governments alone, because governments change, the leadership change, priorities change, they listen to different things. Well, I think the most stable ones, we also need to educate consumers and workers to be involved. And that's one of the reasons why I think in many of these initiatives, worker representatives and consumers are not enough involved. And I think every individual is a consumer. So if you talk about ethical production, ethical behavior, it will reinforce the things. And going forward, I am, in spite of all the doubts I have, I am still optimistic that we will make progress. Things have developed and things will get better. I mean, along the way, sometimes it gets worse, but eventually things should get better.
Thank you, Thomas. Edmund?
Just a quick note that we are not trying to set new standards, but we are trying to get companies to meet the minimum benchmarks of human rights standards. And the next big generational, I think, challenge for us is how do we, because as human rights activists, we are so used to getting states to do things. The question now is how do we get a non-state actor to implement human rights? And I think the ideation thinking moving forward is what are the different ways, discourses and tools that we should be pushing forward to help these companies meet these minimum benchmarks. Thank you.
Thank you, Edmund. Thank you for all the speakers and all the questions from the participants. Next, I'll pass it to Dr. Robin.
Thank you, Husai, and thank you to all the speakers, the panelists, for indeed a very interesting discussion, complementing very nicely our discussion this morning. Let me, before I continue, throw a second poll at you that you could please answer. The question is, do you think that NHRIs in particular should contribute to implementing NAPs? What's your view on that, please? While we wait for your responses, let me remind you to please take our survey. You see it before you. Please answer our survey questions. We need your feedback, your suggestions about how to improve and how we have done. Perhaps is the poll, do we have the results? We see there right in front of us. We have, should they be involved? Should they be involved? Should they contribute? Yes, 81% of the 21 who answered so far. No, 5%, and I don't know, 14%. Okay, very good. Those are your views. I'm curious about the 5% no, but we can come to that another day. So with that said, let me just, as we move to our closing, let me just briefly mention a few points about this panel to summarize the days as we close. To summarize the two panels. So number one, I would like to note a few points. One is that the BHR agenda in Southeast Asia is firmly on the landscape, right? It's firmly on the landscape. And as Thomas and Edmund, and I think all of you were saying, it is part of the landscape and it's a slow moving process, but it is a necessary process that we are engaged in. Secondly, NAPs are useful. They're a useful tool, but they are not an end in by themselves or in and of themselves, as Edmund rightly pointed out. And to use Thomas's words, it's a process. And as Saul also pointed out, it's a process in which we will, if I may put it this way, hopefully get there, right? In terms of deepening the culture of human rights, and I dare say culture of human rights and democracy across the region. NAPs help to fulfill that function, localizing and deepening that human rights culture in the region, localizing it. There is a need for inclusivity and transparency in developing NAPs. And so NHRIs were mentioned, CSOs were mentioned, and of course, trade unions were mentioned. They all need to be involved. And this morning we had a discussion of parliamentarians. They need to be inclusive also because we need to make sure in the baseline studies that should be done that there are, the inclusivity will generate the wide and proper range of issues in each context that should be addressed, which are inclusive of, as Betty was just saying, the gender issue alongside the natural resources, the land rights, the human rights defenders, the indigenous peoples, environmental rights, and so on. Business organizations clearly need to move beyond the philanthropic and voluntarist nature of their involvement, and to move squarely towards these, let's say, more compulsory frameworks, regulations. These, as Edmund pointed out, these already exist that are binding on the state, that are binding on business organizations. And NAPs can help to usefully emphasize those obligations or re-emphasize them and make them part of the conversation and the language and practices of business entities. And so there we mentioned smart regulations, mix of regulations. Another point that came out of this discussion today is advocacy gaps among politicians need to be better aware and more involved. We come back to the parliamentarians, as do business organizations. And we must again here mention the National Human Rights Commissions again. They all have to be a part of this advocacy mix, if I can put it that way. And lastly, the last thing I will mention, I will reiterate one again. I'm going specifically to Saul's point about the need for binding regulations, right? That more compulsory language needs to, be formulated. Even in these NAPs, yes, as we said in panel number 1, they are policy instruments, but they also need to be more closely aligned with human rights standards and other regulatory tools. And that language must be reflected in the NAPs as we go forward. So let me remind you once again, please do take our survey. Secondly, I wish to just call your attention once again to next year's conference on freedom of expression, our 7th international conference. And we welcome expressions for partnerships for this conference from 24 to 26 August of next year. With those points said, let me turn the floor over to Dr. James Gomez for a vote of thanks. James, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. It leaves me really to thank, first of all the participants who stayed, who came on panel 1 and panel 2. Some of you were here the whole day. So thank you very much for your kind attention. We hope it was useful for your learning. I'll start off with thanking the speakers from panel 2, Betty, Thomas, Edmund, Saul. Thank you for your fine interventions, and Husai for the great moderation, and to also record earlier in panel 1 to Paulo and Vicky, who took the floor, gave the intervention, and dealt with a lot of questions, finally moderated by Trisha. I also want to recognize our project lead for business and human rights, Dr. Robin Ramcharan, who's leading the project, and also the rest of the Asia Center team for their efforts in the last few months. Our partner organization, the Friedrich Naumann Foundation. The report which anchors this project, in the new year will be disseminated. We'll come up with a communication plan. We'll talk with our partner to see how we can, further, push out the findings and recommendation. And we are hoping to reach out to all of you, both the participants and the speakers and all the partner organization, which also included call and ideas to work together. With that, we are also, kind of just a couple of weeks away from the end of the year. The holiday season is upon us. So I wish you good tidings, great joy, happy times with your friends and family, and enjoy the new year. And we look forward to a more, friendly and hopefully safe and with more opportunity to travel in 2022. With that, Robin, back to you.
Thank you, James. And all I have to say is thank you very much. Stay safe and keep in touch, and happy holidays.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone.